In a previous video, I went through the steps of how to make a tear-out preventer like this that's used when your blade height is lower than the stock carriage. In this video, I'm going to show you how the jig can be set up to use the blade at full height, and also how to use a tear-out preventer with that same setup. Although it is possible to use the jig in this setting while you're using your blade at full height, your stock carriage is going to need to be to the side of the blade so you don't cut into it. And you're going to be limited to cutting stock in this orientation so long as your cut sticks past the end of the stock carriage. There's no good way to get a tear-out preventer like that, so if you use the jig in this orientation at full blade height, you will need to use score lines to prevent tear-out. But if you're trying to cut a notch like this, you're going to want to clamp the material flatways, and there's just not going to be enough left to clamp it securely. So I'll show you how we can set the jig up so that the stock carriage will pass freely over the top of the blade at full height. In order to accomplish that, we're going to raise the entire jig up with 2 riser blocks, 1 piece of 1/2 inch, which will attach to the miter bar, and then a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that will attach to the 1/2 inch plywood, and then the jig will attach to the piece of 3/4. So now I'll go ahead and take the jig off the miter bar. So we'll start with this piece of 1/2 inch, and it does have a slot where it fastens down in the back so that we can square it to the fence. And we'll screw this down, not super tight, but just until that miter bar is flush with the table saw top. Okay, we'll square that up. Tighten this one down. Okay, now we'll put on our piece of 3/4 inch. And now we'll put the jig back on. Just barely snug for this front screw. And we can also check to make sure that the jig is square to the fence as well. Right there, looks pretty good. Now tighten down the back screw. Now I can crank the blade to full height. And now we have clearance underneath that stock carriage for full depth cuts. So again, if we were to try to make a notch like this now without a score line or a backer, we would end up with something like this as far as tear out on the back side. So a tear out preventer with this setup is going to look very similar to the one I made in the previous video, and I'll show you about that next. So like the other one, this one is tall enough so that it just slips under the stock carriage, and I've added a stretcher on either side so that we don't get any deflection here when the blade passes through. And also, since the jig is up off the table saw about 1.5 inches now, this tear out preventer is just going to mount to this piece of 3/4 plywood with this hole here, and a pan head screw and a washer. And the screw is going to go through this slot into the hole here on the side of the 3/4, and I have a mark here where the center of the hole is, so I know where to get this screw started. Then I'll push this forward until it flushes up with the front of the stock carriage and tighten that screw down. And now, so to cut a notch like this, I think I'll just clamp this in about right here. I'll go ahead and put a clamping guide on this side. Now I'll go ahead and line the blade up with my layout lines, and I'll put carriage stops in at each of those points for reference. I'm going to start over in this position. On my first pass, right when the kerf in this tear-out provocateur isn't getting any taller, I'll know that the top of the blade has run all the way through the stock, and then I'll put a stop in the miter track in front of the jig so that I minimize how far I cut into the tear-out preventer, which will increase the life of it. So now I'll go ahead and make that first pass. Okay, so right there I know that the blade has passed all the way through the stock, so now I'll put my stop in front of the jig. So for that we're going to use the indexing guide, and I've put on a felt bumper right here just to soften the impact of the miter bar. And now we're ready to finish cutting the rest of the notch. All right, loosen this up and we'll see how that looks. So here was the front of the board where the layout lines were. On the back you can see nice crisp cut with no tear out. And now, like the smaller preventer that we built, you have the option of just reversing this to use this side for a tear out preventer, or we can loosen this screw, slide this back, and put another tab in the front here for another tear out preventer, which gives you a few more options for different blades and different blade heights. So full blade height on this table saw is about 3 1/8 heavy, which is the height of the notch we just cut. So I'm going to add a different preventer to the jig here, and then I'll cut this notch with a 2 3/4 blade height. So put a new tear out backer in, which is just a little piece of 1/2 inch. Okay, then I'll set the blade height to 2 3/4, readjust my stop so I don't cut too far into the backer, and cut the other notch. Okay, so there's 2 examples of cutting notches at a taller blade height with your stock clamped in the flat direction using a tear out preventer.